Hello, and welcome to Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I'm Immaculata De Vivo, and I'm one of the co-directors for the science programming here at the Institute. And it is my great pleasure to bring to you today's program entitled Vaccine Equity and Efficacy in the United States and the World. The COVID-19 vaccines are an extraordinary story. Science has delivered a remarkable breakthrough, and these efficacious vaccines are the result of years of research. However, the messaging and the vaccine availability has been more of a challenge. In today's program, our distinguished panelist will address some of these concerns. We, about 45 minutes ago, while I was in a faculty meeting, I was alerted that one of our speakers, Dr. Noah Dagan, a research fellow at the Biomedical Informatics Department at the Harvard Medical School, who is in Israel and was going to present on her research on the Israeli vaccine experience, will not be joining us because of some real world events that are happening right now in Tel Aviv. So she will not, for her safety, she will not be joining us today. But quickly telling my colleague and friend, Dr. Marc Lipsitch, who is the professor of epidemiology and infectious disease at the Harvard T-Chan School of Public Health, the situation, he heroically agreed to present on the Israeli vaccine experience. And for that, we are all eternally grateful to Marc. In addition to Marc, we will have Kate O'Brien, Dr. O'Brien, who's the director of the Department of Immunization, Vaccines, and Biologicals from the World Health Organization. She will talk about the vaccine rollout, but the international distribution. And then we will have Dr. Richard Goldsby, who is a biology professor emeritus at Amherst College. He is the Thomas B. Walton Jr. Memorial Professor of Biology. He will address equity more nationally. And of course, the moderation will be done by our expert in science communication, Dr. Viswanath. He is the Lecom Key Professor of Health Communication in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard T-Chan School of Public Health and the McGraw Patterson Center for Population Sciences at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Now, before we go into the program, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and the annual donors who are watching this afternoon. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public. And for that, we thank you. A brief overview of the program. The framing remarks by Vish will be followed by presentations by our speakers. After the presentations, Vish will engage the speakers in discussion and then turn to moderate the audience Q&A. We encourage those watching to use Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time during the program. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you keep them short so that we can answer as many as possible. And it is now my great pleasure to pass the virtual floor to Dr. Viswanath. Thank you, Vish.
Thank you, Mac. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I want to start where you ended. Let me join you in expressing my gratitude to you, to Sean, Amy, and the entire Radcliffe team for organizing this webinar, a symposium on an extremely important topic of global importance, not just for those of us, in fact, a matter of life and death. And therefore, I'm grateful also to the audience for joining us. So if you think about it, here we are, 17 months later, when we first started hearing about this sort of a flu-ish or flu-like thing that was being experienced in Wuhan, China, in late December, early January. In fact, the news items, if you recall, were even less than half a column inch in a newspaper, or sort of a flyby coverage in other media. And in many ways, many of us, those of us who are engaged in the study of public health emergencies or public health emergency communications have alerted or have sort of warned the public and publics about it. Yet, even I recall talking about it, but not with the kind of feeling that we are experiencing today. And what COVID-19 has done has surprised us. The ferocity with which it has ravaged the globe and people across the globe has been stunning, even though there are some experts who have actually talked about this, and some of them are on the panel today. And over time, we have learned a lot. I think it was, if nothing else, it has taught us a great deal of humility, how much we did not know, and how much the knowledge has changed as science evolved over time. What should not have surprised us is that COVID-19 affected very different groups in very different ways. Certainly, some groups were much more disproportionately affected, suffered from it compared to other groups. Simply put, class matters, place matters, race and ethnicity matters. And clearly, a few months into the COVID-19 crisis, we realized how some groups were disproportionately suffering from it. Those who are poor, those who are people of color, minorities, and in neighborhoods with limited services. That should not have been a surprise. Anybody who has spent any time with public health would have predicted that kind of inequalities. But even more shocking for us is that it looks like, and it seems like, we haven't learned any lessons from the early days of COVID-19. As Dr. De Vivo pointed out, it is certainly amazing that we have vaccines which are now available within a very short span of time. Very effective vaccines have been produced, designed and produced. And that by itself is a sort of a scientific miracle if you think about it. But more than that, it speaks to the investment in the scientific enterprise. And for that, we are grateful. However, what should not have been a surprise is the inequities in vaccination that we are experiencing globally, not just in the US. From everything we know from our work on social determinants of health, should have predicted what we are facing in terms of equity, right? And some of us have actually talked about it, even as late as September or as early as September or October last year, that this is likely to happen. Yet, here we are, that we're again discussing the issue of equity, even though we know that this would be coming in. We would be experiencing this, right? It is inexcusable, almost unconscionable, that we are even discussing this topic today, even though we knew that this would happen. So we want to understand, that's what we want to try to disentangle today. How did we get here? Where are we going with this? What can we do about this? Because this crisis is not over. So I will start off with my colleague, Dr. Marc Lipsitch. Marc, please take over.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me 10 minutes ago. And for, it's not heroic to step in. There are a lot of heroic people on this call, but it's a pleasure to be here. And I look forward to talking about some of the same topics that Dr. Dagan was going to speak about. But what I'll do is provide two vignettes from Israel as a laboratory for the effects of vaccination. As many of you know, Israel has now surpassed 80% coverage with the Pfizer vaccine in age groups, all age groups over 30, and high coverage also in the younger age group. So it's one of the very fastest vaccine rollouts in the world, and therefore provides an opportunity to study the effects that you can't see just from clinical trials. I have the pleasure of working with 3 different groups in Israel, including the group that that produced the paper that Dr. Dagan led on the impact of the vaccine in Israel, or the effectiveness of the vaccine in Israel. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll talk about a second unrelated project very briefly. So one of the first questions that arises when you're trying to study a vaccine and understand its impact is how well it works outside of a randomized trial. And the challenges to understanding that are that when you are not in the setting of a very carefully controlled study, as epidemiologists know, there are many factors that may differ between those who get the vaccine and those who don't. Some of them by design, like older people are typically vaccinated first, and we're in Israel. And some of them not so much by design. And this wonderful document from the World Health Organization was produced by some colleagues of ours that really lays out the challenges of doing that kind of study. As a beautiful illustration of that, this is a slide that I screenshotted from one of Dr. Dagan's colleagues at the Clalit Research Institute. The largest HMO in Israel has a research institute where she works, and Ron Balitzer, her colleague, works. And he showed these data showing the exact social determinants that Vish was talking about. These are deciles of income, and on the black and red are the vaccination coverage at some particular point. So the richer you were, the more likely you were to be vaccinated by a certain point, and the lower your COVID attack rate, shown here in these numbers on the right. So if you didn't adjust for things like this in an analysis, you would think that vaccine was even more protective than it is, because poor people don't get vaccinated and do get COVID. So you need to be very careful in your methodology. So what Noah did, with some help from Miguel Hernan and me at the Harvard Chan School, was to design a cohort study where each individual, when they become vaccinated, is matched on many, many different demographic factors and health factors against somebody who is not getting vaccinated. So you're comparing people who are very much like each other, except that for whatever reason, one of them got vaccinated and the other didn't. We were very thoughtful, I hope, about the ways in which we chose those matching criteria. I'm happy to talk about that. What that allowed us to understand was that the vaccine was comparably effective in Israel as it was in the randomized controlled trial. So this second panel, B, was an outcome similar to that in the randomized controlled trial. You see that over the first several days after vaccination, people who do and don't get the vaccine look alike. And then, as in the randomized trial, there starts to be a separation as there are more outcomes, more illnesses in the unvaccinated and fewer in the vaccinated, with about a 95% reduction if you start counting after the vaccine has taken effect. Similarly, could look at hospitalization and see very much larger numbers, hundreds of hospitalizations in hundreds of thousands of people, so that one could do better statistics than you can do in a trial that's smaller, and also severe cases and deaths. What that also allowed us to do was to look at the effectiveness by subgroup. One of the key questions that was partially addressed in the randomized trial was, does it work in older people and in people with comorbidities? And what this showed was that it works comparably well in older people and almost as well in people with 3 or more coexisting conditions, certainly as well in people with 2 coexisting conditions. So those were 2 of the important questions that were left uncertain. I'll just very briefly talk about another project that asked another question that was not forefronted in the randomized trials, but is very important to understanding the vaccine's effects. And that is how well it works against infectiousness or potential transmission. The question here is that we don't know from the trials whether the vaccine was mainly reducing people's illness or whether it was also making them unable to transmit because they didn't get infected, or if they did get infected, they made less virus. And I'll just jump to the results. This is work led by Dr. Gili Regev-Yochai, also a Harvard School of Public Health lecturer, but the head of infection control at Sheba Medical Center in Tel Aviv. And what we were able to show is that the vaccine effectiveness against infection, becoming infected, was around 65%. So some of the 95% effectiveness against symptomatic disease was reducing symptoms, but a big part of it was reducing infection. And even more strikingly, if you compare the amount of virus present in people who are unvaccinated and get infected against those who are vaccinated and get infected, you see about a 97% reduction in the amount of virus that is present in those people, or 5 CT values for those who want to see it in that scale. So a major reduction in likely infectiousness. Still very early days, and there's much more to show. But I think what this demonstrates is that Israel has been an excellent setting to study vaccination because of a combination of high quality health research institutes and an IT infrastructure that can support it, a high functioning healthcare system, and rapid rollout. And then we've seen 2 instances of that. And I'll just finish by saying that there's lots more work being done by many groups to try to answer questions about herd immunity, variants, duration of immunity, and other questions. Thank you. I'd now like to pass the floor over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Kate O'Brien.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I'm so delighted to be here. And I'd like to share my screen so I can share some slides with you. What I'd like to follow on from what Mark was talking about is sort of where we're at in terms of global vaccine equity and rollout, and just share some of the information that we have about how this is going. So this is probably a figure, an image that you've seen versions of before. We're now, sadly, at over 3 million deaths, almost at 3.3 million deaths. And when we actually look at this, starting from on the right-hand side, from the beginning of the pandemic, it was in the spring and summer of 2020 when a dual goal was set by the world through WHO's member state process for COVID vaccines. And that dual goal was really about protecting public health and minimizing the social and economic impact of the pandemic, with this primary focus on reducing mortality and severe disease and protecting the health system, not knowing at that time whether we would have any vaccines that had made it through efficacy trials by 2021 or late 2020. And the supply projections were such that it was estimated that, based on some models, we thought that there would likely be enough supply to at least immunize 20% of the world's population. And that 20% was a helpful number because it happens to be the same proportion of the world's population that is accounted for by health workers and other priority population groups, older adults, people with underlying medical conditions those are conditions that put people at high risk of serious disease or death. And so dial forward 1 year, and we have 15 vaccines that are in use around the world, with now almost 1.3 billion doses of authorized COVID vaccines that have been administered in 206 countries, territories, areas, and economies, with the different shades of green showing the number of doses per 100 population. And we can see that although almost every country in the world has now started to introduce COVID vaccine, there are many parts of the world where there is a high inequity about the number of doses that are available and the proportion of the population that's getting vaccinated. And when, certainly for US audiences, especially, I think it's important to recognize that there are 15 vaccines now in use. And the most commonly used vaccine is the AstraZeneca vaccine, being used in 168 countries, followed by the Pfizer vaccine, the Sinopharm vaccine from China in 62 countries, Moderna in 60, and you can see the range of the number of countries that are using a variety of other products. So we've had very, very considerable success beyond, I think, anybody's imagination of how many vaccines would achieve the measures of safety, efficacy, and quality manufacturing. What's very interesting is that 168 countries are using 2 or more vaccines, so complicated vaccine programs. And COVAX is a critical part of trying to achieve global equity. COVAX is the facility that has 191 participants, meaning countries or territories in it, that have joined to procure vaccines on a collective basis and distribute those vaccines across the 191 participants using an equitable and fair allocation mechanism. So COVAX has shipped almost 60 million doses to 122 participants, the yellow countries shown on this slide as of May 10th, so as of yesterday. Importantly, 36 of those participants started their campaign as a result of COVAX doses. They otherwise did not have any means of starting their vaccination campaign. But the equity issue is really this. A little under 20% of the doses around worldwide have been administered in low and middle income countries, while they represent 50% of the world's population. So you can see the latest dose proportion here on this middle column, and the proportion of the population that's represented by countries in that income strata. So 45% of doses are being administered in high income countries that only account for 15% of the world's population. And if we look at that another way, over time, this inequity is decreasing slowly, but high income countries have administered almost 80 times more doses per inhabitant than low income countries have administered. And that's not because doses have not been procured by the COVAX facility. The COVAX facility, this shows the supply availability of products that have been committed through contracts with the COVAX facility, a broad number of products, so a very good portfolio of products. Now looking like the COVAX facility has access to approximately 3 billion doses of vaccine. And yet those doses are not coming at the same time as they're coming to the high income countries that have procured their doses through bilateral deals. So this shows you when the doses are coming, and this timing of doses is the very critical issue right now, why we have countries that are much, much further ahead than other countries that are at the very beginning of protecting their highest priority, highest risk groups. And so this equity in the global COVID-19 vaccination sort of landscape can really be addressed. We do have solution space on this. The first is on dose sharing now by countries that have a large number of doses through their own bilateral deals. Many countries have moved well beyond that highest priority 20% and are progressing to be immunizing people at very low risk of serious disease, including those in teenage years and early 20s. Dose timing can be addressed not only by dose sharing, but by accelerating doses that COVAX has committed through contractual arrangements. And that acceleration can happen both by the manufacturers and by countries that have bilateral deals with the manufacturers, signaling, communicating to the manufacturer that they're willing to step back from the timing of the doses. Third is by increasing manufacturing capacity. There is virtually no manufacturing capacity in Africa, and this is something that has to be corrected, both by sharing of that capacity and of know-how. Fully funding the COVAX facility is the fourth area of solution space. Those doses that I showed you of over 3 billion doses that would account then for 30% of the population of those countries can only be secured if COVAX is fully funded. And then there are individual things that people can do. And I'll speak a little bit about the Go Give One campaign. So I just want to touch in the next 3 slides, these are my last slides, on 3 of those actionable items. The first is dose sharing. Dose sharing has begun. In fact, several countries, France and New Zealand in particular, have announced dose sharing deals where they will be sharing doses through the COVAX facility starting now. And there are at least 4 other countries. The US has been very public about having 60 million AstraZeneca doses that will not be used in the US. Those need to be urgently donated, and we strongly feel that those should be donated through the COVAX facility so that they can be equitably allocated to countries that most need them. Spain, Portugal, and Sweden have also announced dose sharing arrangements that they will undertake through the COVAX facility. The US has just announced their support for a TRIPS waiver. Statement from the Ambassador Catherine Tai on the TRIPS waiver for COVID-19, the WHO Director General commending the US for this decision to temporarily have a waiver on intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines, and the EU supporting COVID vaccine patent waiver talks is also advancing. And the third issue that in that list of solutions is just what individuals can do. We have a Go Give One campaign. This is a means by which COVID-19 vaccines can, funding for COVID-19 vaccines can be secured from individuals. Money raised by pressing the donate button goes to the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment, supporting the 92 countries who have doses that are procured on their behalf. So this is a means for both matching. There are matching programs within the Go Give One campaign to increase the delivery of vaccines for the world and prioritizing those who need them most in countries that can't afford them. And this is not just a moral issue. This is the smart thing to do in terms of vaccine equity because of variants of concern, because we are not going to end this pandemic by single countries addressing vaccination within their own borders with trade and travel, international travel, the movement of the virus across the borders. This is a global solution that's needed, and only through equitable distribution access will we actually achieve the end of this pandemic, which we are all so desperate to get to. So I'll end there, and I think I'm passing over to Dick Goldsby. So over to you, Dick, please.
All right, great. Well, I'd like to begin by saying how happy I am to be with this group, and I want to thank the Radcliffe Institute for organizing this event. And I really learned a great deal from what my predecessors have already told us about this terrible pandemic. This is a session about equity, and I certainly want to address the matter of equity. There's been a great deal of talking, a great deal of negotiating, and even some appropriate quarreling about matters of equity. But I want to be sure that we keep in mind also the importance of making sure that when the next pandemic comes around, we have something of value to equitably distribute, something that will be as effective and as powerful as what we have now seems to be promising to be. We're in the midst of the COVID pandemic now, but history tells us we should expect others. And for 3/4 of a century now, we've been able to hold some of the worst bacterial scourges and other microbial scourges to some extent pinned in by using antibiotics and by using various antimicrobials. Problems are beginning to emerge. We're beginning to see widespread emergence of antibiotic-resistant bacterial strains, and we're finding that the pharmaceutical companies that at one time were very much involved in discovering new antibiotic drugs that might be used to block or at least to confine some microbial infections, they have left the field. They've left the field because they need to invest large amounts of money, and they know that the profits they get are commensurate with these investments. One could then argue about that on one side. The problem is we have not continued the pace of antimicrobial development of antimicrobial agents. And if we don't pick this up, we may be prepared for the next pandemic that comes along, and that's something that I think we ought to be very worried about. But back to the current one, back to COVID. When this came along, I'm going to step into the classroom now to frame the problem that we confronted. The problem was you could either wait for something like natural herd immunity to develop, or if you were fortunate and if the gods of technology smiled on you, you could develop a vaccine to control the program. If we take a look at the first slide, what we'll see on that slide is a very simple graphic that shows the difference in the approach of looking for natural herd immunity as opposed to using a vaccine. In the case of natural herd immunity, what happens is the virus comes into a population, it infects people, a number of them get sick, too many of them die, and among the survivors who've been exposed to this pathogen, you will have induction of immunity, and they will have antibody that will protect them against subsequent encounters with the pathogen, and to some extent protect the population against these attacks by virtue of something that's been called herd immunity, and it's actually a real phenomenon. But it's painful. One has to suffer hospitalizations. One has to see members of one's community die in the case of severe infections, such as that caused by SARS-CoV-2. On the other hand, if you're fortunate enough to be able to devise a strategy that allows you to vaccinate, that is to say, train the immune system ahead of time to make antibodies and other agents that are capable of fighting the particular pathogen, then what happens when the pathogen comes along? You already have an endowment of these protective agents, and so you stop the infection in its track. You get just a little bit of virus or whatever the pathogen happens to be produced, and you walk out with a bonus of having made an even greater immune response than you might have normally made. You're protected, and other members of your population are protected. This is the kind of miracle that we saw happen, that other speakers have referred to already this afternoon, that we saw happen this year with COVID. If we look at the next slide, the sort of thing that we'll see is a sort of pictorial depiction of what we think of as the big three COVID vaccines, at least here in the United States. The vaccines made by Pfizer, with strong technical input from their German partner BioNTech, by Moderna, a tiny, relatively speaking, little company in Cambridge that's been working on messenger RNA technologies, and they have vaulted from fledgling company to biotechnology behemoth by virtue of their extraordinary development in collaboration with the National Institutes of Health, the NIAID, in designing a very effective messenger RNA vaccine. And of course, there's Johnson & Johnson that uses an adenovirus vector. All of these to train the immune system to make antibodies that can actually prevent the COVID virus from attaching to cells and producing an infection. Now, these vaccines are very efficacious, particularly those from Moderna and from Pfizer. And all three of them do what you really want to require a vaccine to do. They prevent, they lower the death rate very dramatically, and they, of course, reduce the number of serious illnesses and hence avoid the kind of strain on the hospital system that we can have. I hope there will be time at the end of my talk to return to an important consideration as to how these vaccines were developed. But now I want to turn to the question of equity. And if we can take a look at the next slide, we got off to a very bad start here with regard to equity matters here in the United States. In his introduction to the symposium, Dr. Viswanath pointed out quite appropriately that just as many who studied public health would have predicted at the beginnings of this pandemic here in the United States, we found that the most vulnerable economically, the most vulnerable groups socially were the groups on which this pandemic fell hardest. And there was a great deal of worry as to whether or not the system, as it's often called, would deliver adequate amounts and adequate opportunities for vaccination to various communities of color here in the United States. Sometime on after the introduction of the vaccines and after a great deal of worry, which appropriately continues, we have had an outcome where we can now start to assess the level of vaccine equity here in the United States at the present point. I'm going to review with you some data that the CDC issued just this past Saturday. And it's a graph, it's summarized here in this graph that looks at equity in the following way. Consider a population, an ethnic or a racial population here in the United States, and consider their population percentage of the United States, and compare their percentage representation in the American population with their representation in terms of their abilities to have gotten a shot or two shots of the vaccine. If we look at the graph here, we notice that the white population, a little more than 60% of the American population, has received somewhat more vaccines than would be proportioned to their population, but not much more. If we look at the population look at various Asian American populations, we find that there is pretty much congruence between the fraction of the population they represent and the fraction of the vaccinated doses that have been given that they have received. The same thing is one's very happy to see true with regard to the Native American population, where there is, in a very welcome way, parity, and in fact, just a little better than parity, well-deserved, slight excess of parity for Native Americans in terms of them having received just a few more doses of the vaccine than their percentage in the population would have predicted. So that was a happy, if unexpected, outcome. If you look at the Hispanic population, various Hispanic populations, and look at the Black population here in the United States, what you see are disparities in terms of look at their representation in the population with regard to numbers, and look at the numbers of doses that have been given, and there are differences, there are deficits, but not the size deficits that many of us expected there would be. So in this news that we wish were better, it isn't nearly as bad as we thought it might be, and measures that are being taken, one hopes, such as relying much more on trusted messengers, the local minister, the family health center, schools, and various community gatherings, relying on centers such as those. One hopes that one will be able to bring those numbers into even better standing and hopefully into parity by the end of the year. We will see what happens. At the bottom of this slide, I've assembled some data on attitudes toward COVID vaccination. If you want a vaccination, you're more likely to get one than if you're skeptical about vaccinations or if you've decided that this is not something for you. And if we look at the American population, what we find is that it's true that Hispanic populations and Black populations show somewhat more vaccine hesitancy than white populations, not as much as some would have suspected, but somewhat more. And that's a margin that needs to be whittled down needs to be whittled back. The Great Divide is a surprising and a challenging one. The Great Divide is a political one here in the United States. Nearly 80% of people who think of themselves as Democrats view vaccination favorably. 46% of people or so who view themselves Republicans view vaccination unfavorably. That's a very serious situation. It's a very serious situation because this represents a large chunk of the American population. Much of this Republican population that looks at things this way belongs to the white population here in the United States, which is the largest racial group by far in the United States. And when you get that size chunk of that population not accepting vaccination because they reject it for a variety of reasons, when you have such a reluctant, such a recalcitrant, large group of individuals, one who's thought a bit about biology, and certainly our colleagues who are evolutionary biologists can make very dire predictions as to what very well might happen here in the United States. There has been a great deal of talk, appropriately so, and a great deal of worry, necessarily so, about variants that are arising in the virus population. Look, if you get any biological population that's replicating, you're going to get some mutation, and that mutation is eventually going to end up producing some phenotypic variation. And of course, the viruses, what we're worried about is viruses become more infectious. What we're worried about is that viruses undergo mutations that make them less likely to be neutralized by the antibodies that we've made as a consequence of prior infection, or much better as a consequence of appropriate vaccination. Here's what an evolutionist would say about a large, relatively large minority fraction of the American population that moves freely back and forth through the entire population, through all strata of that population, who resist vaccination. The kind of SARS variant you're going to select for in a population like that, you're going to select for variants that are immune, if you will, to the vaccine. This is going to be a cauldron that has a capacity, a high capacity, to develop an extraordinarily dangerous kind of mutants, because there will be a premium, considering that the American population is very likely to be about 70 or 75% vaccinated, probably by September or so of this year. This is going to mean that we're going to have a situation where we could very, very likely select a particularly dangerous set of COVID causing viruses. Now, so I think that all of us who have recalcitrant and reluctant Republican friends have an obligation to take them out to lunch, to do something very nice for them, so we can get their attention and open their ear, and try as we can to persuade them to look at things a bit differently. I want to wind things up by saying that I think if there is a bright spot in this pandemic, and it's very, very hard to find one, if you can find a single bright spot, it's that it showed our society what it simply has to be prepared to do when we have the next pandemic approaches. And it might be a strategy that we would want to undertake even before the next pandemic comes along. Here's what we learned. We learned that what we have to do, it was given this dramatic name, Operation Warp Speed. We learned that we have to de-risk going into expensive infectious diseases that will require upfront production facilities before people know they're going to gain a financial from doing a vaccine development or from doing antibody. We have got to, as a country, as a government, we've got to de-risk that population by investing ahead of this and making these not risky activities for companies. Operation Warp Speed did that for a number of companies that undertook the task of developing COVID vaccines in very, very large quantities. Let me wrap up by saying that we are simply going to have to make sure that our vaccine program here in the United States reaches our entire population, even those across various political spectra. And we're also going to have to position ourselves in such a way that we are administratively poised to foster development of new vaccines, to foster development of more antibiotic development. Thank you very much. Vish, I hand the floor back to you.
Thank you so much, Dick. You made some excellent points, so hopefully the connection will be stable enough so that we can come back and ask you some questions. There are a number of questions from the audience. I have some questions. I'm going to sort of paraphrase to weave in their questions too. But my first question, I think will go to Geneva and Kate. I wanted to ask you this question. So you showed some data, particularly I think I was looking at your slide number 12. I may be getting the numbers wrong. And that was, I must admit, a depressing slide to me. In some ways, it showed somewhat even optimistic, I guess, that it will take until 2022, maybe, to 2021 or early 2022 to get vaccines into the hands of people in a number of low-income countries. And that's based on the assumption that the production will continue without problems, we'll have more vaccines, and we don't need booster shots, etc. So could you comment on that? I mean, from an equity perspective, what are the challenges we have? Because I want to be very cautious in the way I say it. It's almost like a trickle-down effect, right? Economics and trickle-down economics. Just wait your turn. We are going to get there eventually. I know you're all working very hard, trying your best to get it out there, but those data are very disheartening. So would you like to comment on that and how we can address that?
I sure can. Yeah, thanks for that question. I think we have to be clear about what the situation is right now. The world is in a situation where high-income countries have procured through contracts the majority of the doses in the world. That means it's not simply about the doses that are projected to be available in 2021 and early 2022. It's very, very much about the timing of when those doses come. And so this is an incredibly important point. The second is if you take as a round number 8 billion people in the world, if we envision that, if we're only talking about those over 18 years of age, the number of doses that we need is likely available in the world, but it is very, very inequitably distributed right now. And the example that I'll give you is that high-income countries have secured through contracts enough doses that is 4 times the number of doses that are needed to vaccinate their populations. So the question is, what is going to happen to those doses? They are simply not available for other entities to procure them. And we really have to have a serious conversation now, not in December, not in November, but we need a serious conversation now about what it is that high-income countries are willing to do now to actually make some corrections to this situation. And so I think one of the framings here is there are solutions that are available, but it does take the commitment of countries that have bilateral deals, large bilateral deals, to actually take some action so that doses are available for countries that are at the very, very beginning of their immunization program that have not yet even immunized their health workers. that have not yet really started to immunize even those people who are over 65. And simultaneously, we have countries that are progressing potentially down into adolescent age groups. So are pursuing a very, very different and more advanced goal domestically for their country, but it's not going to work. It's not going to work because if we're not all progressing relatively together, we fully understand where the pressure is going to come from, of variance, the impact that it will have on the economies of the high income countries. This is not about charity. This is not about sort of doing the right thing, a moral argument, although I think that is a compelling argument. We do have economic analyses that also show the massive financial losses in high income countries if we don't pursue a more equitable approach to vaccination, because we are in a global economy. And we cannot actually move that economy unless it's moved around the world. So I'll stop there. We can certainly address other specific questions, but I think we have to have a much greater understanding that this is not about charity. This is not about just acting because it's the morally right thing to do. This is about the biology of the pathogen. It's about global economics. It's about getting economies back on track. And the amount of funding that is required to actually secure what is needed is a tiny fraction of the trillions of dollars that are being spent in high income countries.
Right. So thank you, Kate. That was very, very well put. I want to go to Marc next, but before I go to Marc, I'm already alerting you, that I'll come to you next. Kate, just to follow up on that point. So as a student of public health communications, I don't hear the arguments you have so eloquently made right now. The arguments I hear are sometimes moral arguments, are mostly arguments that we need to get people vaccinated in the high income countries I'm talking about. I don't hear about these arguments about that, it is in global interest. It is in fact in my interest that other people in other countries get vaccinated. And so where are we failing in that? How come we are not articulating this argument? I'm not talking about WHO's press releases or statements, as you said so well, but you don't hear it, because this is what I pay my attention to day and night, these kinds of arguments.
Well, I think we're in a really siloed communication space, depending on what you read, what you listen to, where you're getting your information from. I think some of these compelling arguments are being made, but they're certainly not, I fully agree with you, they're not in the lay media across all channels. And I think the point that was made so eloquently by several people already is that, especially in the United States, vaccination and the response to the COVID pandemic has become a politicized topic. Mm-hmm. It's no longer about public health. It's no longer about science. It's no longer about what we'll get, what is good for people's health and livelihoods and protection. It's about very siloed social beliefs that are really driving the conversation. And I think that that's obviously not coming from the pandemic. The pandemic and the response to the pandemic is a casualty of something that has happened in certainly in the United States for some number of years, but also it's happening around the world. This is not unique to the United States. And I think we have to absolutely get politics out of the public health response so that information that is credible, scientific, economic information is actually moving into all kinds of media channels, especially social media. And we're doing as much social media as we can possibly do, and really encouraging this of all stakeholders here. I think that's sort of where we're failing, and what some of the solutions are.
Thank you. I'll come back to you some of those issues, and I also wanted to, and that relates to somewhat what Dick was saying. But Marc, I have, your group has done as much as anybody I know, right from the beginning of the pandemic, in modeling the trajectory of this disease. You and Noah and others, some of our mutual friends and colleagues in Hong Kong and other places have done incredible work, and we all learned a lot from this modeling work you have done. So one question that keeps puzzling, that puzzles me is, and to an extent, this kind of modeling has been very helpful to us. These trials that you talked about and have been very helpful to us. But how did we miss this mark on issue of equity? That is often front and center for all of us, right, in public health. Is it because of data absenteeism that we don't have data from certain groups in the population? And is it something to do with the way we model these things? Or is it because of the way policymakers and decision makers use these models? Do you want, can you speak to that a bit from an equity perspective?
I can try. I think it's many things, and I don't think it's about models or about one particular approach to science. I think it's about our social choices. And what I mean by that, excuse me, is that we decided before the pandemic as a society that it was okay collectively by our votes and lack of votes and policies, that it was okay to have a system domestically in which some people get adequate health care and others don't. That leaves people with disparate levels of comorbidities and the social determinants of health, as you mentioned earlier. And we tolerate that and have continued to tolerate that. It's not just the United States. I mean, putting aside the between country issues, if I showed data from Israel about vaccine and COVID disparities by wealth. There have been similar studies showing the same thing in Chile and in other places. So unfortunately, again, putting aside the international comparison for a minute, each country seems to tolerate levels of disparities that then get amplified by COVID. Now, when we get to the global issue, I think that the problem is that, as Kate mentioned, there are no vaccine manufacturing facilities in Africa, or very few. The global north has most, and we have, again, it's decision making at the global level obviously is very different, but we've set up a system that is not that's not designed to treat everyone's health equally. I will say that there are some bright spots in the sense that none of us would have had vaccines as fast as we did if it hadn't been for the international efforts, particularly those of CEPI, which she showed on one of her slides, the group that has been sponsoring research. Had been sponsoring research on coronavirus vaccines, on mRNA platforms, and on viral vector platforms before, and was out ahead of the issue. That was partly a response to Ebola, and or it was that program was started in response to Ebola and was a case of great scientific foresight, giving us something as a world that we have then distributed the way we distribute many goods in the world, which is unequally. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that a lot of good things happened while we focus relentlessly on trying to make them happen fairly for more people.
Thank you, Marc. So let me go to Dick. Dick, you rightly said, and I know even Marc and others have raised this issue, that we should be prepared for the next pandemic. We should get ready for the next pandemic. And every time we do this, inequalities always emerge. right? I mean, we never seem to learn our lessons. And so now, so what do we do now? I mean, to really, someone has asked in the question and answer session, now there will be variants. We may need booster shots. Even while we are, Kate and our colleagues are trying to get vaccines into low-income countries. So how do we, how do we get to this equity issue in the US as you see it? Maybe even a brief answer would be, I would be grateful.
Well, I guess I would say, to some extent, we've seen parts of this movie before. That is to say, when the HIV epidemic came along, the United States was slow, first of all, to help its own population for reasons that sometimes had to do with various prejudices people had. But then it caught on here in the United States. And finally, George Bush pushed on the advice of a number of people, such as Anthony Fauci, the PEPFAR program, which was an extremely generous and far-reaching and effective program for helping with the AIDS crisis in Africa. So we've done this before. We did learn. It took us much too long. We should have accelerated learning now, and I hope that's what we see with the COVID crisis. If I can quickly say one more thing, Vish, and that is, Katie pointed out that in one's own economic interest, it would make sense to control this pandemic all across the world. It also makes sense in the interest of one's own health that one control this pandemic across the world, because viral variants will get on airplanes, they'll get on boats, and they'll come here, and they'll travel around the country, and they'll settle in wherever there's a suitable host for them. So it really is, and as you pointed out too, Vish, it really is in our own interest to do something about the problems abroad.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So, in the 3 or 4 minutes we have, I have this question, for Kate, and then maybe a general question for everyone. Kate, the TRIPS program policy you mentioned, everyone's got excited when when the announcement came out. But is that so? But the challenge is production, right? I mean, even Mark was saying that, right? Is that going to, so given the problem we are facing now, by the time we go through this entire process, I don't know when we will start, the whole, people will take advantage if ever these things are waived. So what do we do now in that sense? So is that the solution?
Yeah, IP waivers, first of all, I think there's to some degree some misunderstanding about what exactly the impact of an IP waiver will have and when it will occur. So Mark is right, there are no COVID vaccine manufacturers in Africa. There is fill finish that will be starting for some of the vaccines, but there are vaccine producers in Africa. Yellow fever vaccine is manufactured there, and there is capacity in Africa on vaccine manufacturing. There are short, medium, and long-term actions that need to happen. The very acute short-term ones that will, in fact, accelerate manufacturing, will accelerate doses, has to do with bottlenecks that are occurring now. I'm sure people have heard in the news about equipment that is simply not moving across borders. We've seen tweets out of Serum Institute of India pleading for the release of reagents and plastic equipment that is needed in the production of vaccines. So these things are starting to move, but they have been bottlenecks until now. We have examples of 1,000 liters of product that is sitting there unable to be moved into vials because of a lack of filtering equipment. Then there are medium-term issues of tech transfer. And then there are the long-term issues, which is really about sharing of IP, sharing of know-how, which is part of IP. It's not enough to have the recipe. You need to know how to do it. And so each of these elements needs to be addressed, both for the short term, the medium term, and the long term, because this is not the only pandemic that we're going to have, and it's not the only vaccine issue that we're going to have. So it's a sort of full portfolio of response, but you're absolutely right. The immediate issue is not going to be resolved by the TRIPS waiver.
Thank you. Marc, one last question for you. So what do we do next? So people such as you have been communicating, in addition to doing this research in your teams and labs, influencing leaders and policymakers, as well as people with your communications. Based on the work you all have been doing and what we have seen with the Israeli experience with the clinical trials, what should we do next, especially from an equity perspective? What do we need to do?
That's a hard one. You asked me the hard question.
I do, Marc.
Well, I think I'm going to defer to Kate to who's really answered that question on the global scale, and I'll talk a little bit in the U.S. And here I'm speaking a little outside my field of scientific knowledge or of professional knowledge, but so I'm speaking as an educated layperson. But it seems to me that that we heard about hesitancy, and we've heard about lack of access as a challenge to equity, and it seems to me that we should not separate those things as two different problems, but that they're really, in some sense, different sides of the same problem. In that, when we make any decision as people, we sort of consider how much of a pain it is to do something and how much we want to do something, and then we decide whether to do that thing. And I think vaccines are like that. If it's really hard to get a vaccine because you have to make an appointment and you don't have easy access online and they're far away and all of that, then even the littlest bit of hesitancy becomes a barrier. But if someone knocks on your door, to put it on the other very extreme, and says, would you like a vaccine? I have it here, I can give it to you, which can't be scaled totally, but you can imagine something that's much closer to that than big stadiums 20 miles away. Then you have to be really, really hesitant before you say no. And moreover, there seems to be some evidence that when people see their friends getting vaccinated, they are more interested in getting vaccinated themselves. And so my thought, and it's just one of many, is that we should really try to address hesitancy with access, and access to some extent from the other direction of trying to educate people about the need, to make them willing to make even a greater effort to get vaccinated. And that if we lower the barriers and increase the education simultaneously, we'll do better than treating those as kind of separate problems.
Thank you. I think we are way over time. Mac, you want to take over? So thank you, everyone. You. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. This concludes our program today. I want to thank our panelists. You guys were terrific, very thoughtful presentations. We hope that you'll join us next fall for our annual science symposium, which this year will focus on a range of topics related to artificial intelligence. The program will be held on Friday, October 22nd, 2021. Today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week or so. For information on upcoming events at Radcliffe, virtual programming, see the videos, or to see videos of past events, go to www.radcliffe.harvard.edu. I'm sorry to rush, but we are way over time, and I want to thank everyone for doing a terrific job and asking great questions. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, everyone.